I do think this idea of getting a good deal can be a little bit universal. It's just the question is, how do you convey what's a good deal? So the psychology of not wanting to be cheated or feel like it's unfair can be pretty universal. And then how we signal that, sometimes it's a discount, sometimes it's relativity, sometimes it's a decoy. There's different anchors that you could give people. That then signals what's a good deal or not. And if you're aware of reference pricing, so if you're aware of what the competitors are doing in highly competitive markets, then you can't be Shopify, which, puts it in small gray text in hopes that people don't pay attention, at least in the beginning. You need other signals.
Yeah. Welcome to the Product Tea with Leah. I am your host, Leah Darrin, and we are about to spill the tea with the best from tech about product, growth, and senior leadership topics. Welcome back to the Product Tea, where we dive into the minds of those who hack our everyday decisions. Today, we've snagged a real-life wizard of the irrational. I think it's called Irrational. The co-founder of Irrational Labs, she has been spotted in a while, convincing tech giants and startups alike that humans aren't just spreadsheets with legs. From creating potions that nudge us towards better choices to co-founding Common Sense Labs, where she magically transforms financial bewilderment into savvy saving spells, she's done it all. Today, we explore the mysterious corridors of our mind and maybe, just maybe, find out why I bought that third blender on Amazon, even though I don't need one. Let's get ready to hear what's up with our minds. Welcome to the Product Tea, Kristen Berman. How are you doing this morning?
Great for having me. Great intro, and I'm excited to talk about your blender.
Thank you very much. How would you rate this introduction from 1 total fallacy, survivorship BS to 10 double-blind study?
I think it's a 10. I would do one of a new Gen AI emoji from Apple. I would create one for this.
Very good. You just passed the test to continue the podcast, so I'm very glad to talk about it. But before we do that, can you introduce yourself to the audience in a couple sentences?
Yes. My name is Kristen Berman. I am the co-founder, CEO of Irrational Labs, and I think deeply about human behavior. So study why we do what we do, and then help product teams and marketing teams apply those insights, those psychologies to grow and develop their product. And I really like it. I really like understanding what humans do. We tend to do this work with product and marketing teams ranging from Microsoft, LinkedIn, Intuit, Walmart, and healthcare. So we've worked with a ton of smaller healthcare companies to large ones like Optum and Roche. And then we do it also with finance, and we've worked with smaller fintechs, or smaller when Chime was smaller, and Varo. Now they're larger, and larger banks, from international banks to investment companies.
That is really cool. And I was really excited to talk about it with you, because I feel like we're working somewhat in the same kind of space, and I don't know anything about it because I'm just the worst scientist that you can have on board, because I have dyslexia and I'm really bad at reading studies. So I always have to go with what my gut tells me. No, but without a joke, I'm very excited about this. But before we start, what do people get wrong about you once they get to know you?
Great. An interesting question. So let's think about this. So I think, and I'm going to pause and be unclear about this, because that is actually what people get wrong about me, is that I am sometimes very confident. I can display a level of confidence in an opinion, and most of my beliefs are loosely held. So kind of as a researcher, as somebody who studies human behavior, we know that there's not a pure answer. This is for sure going to work in all cases. And so I have a lot of loosely held beliefs, and yet my tone can come across like I'm very confident in something. And so I remind my team a lot that most beliefs are loosely held.
I have the same problem. I would like to talk about this. So one thing that I started to work one thing that I started to notice when I started to get titles that mean something to other people is that because you have the title, they already start to change on how to treat you, right? So I don't know, let's say you're a low-level peon somewhere at Microsoft and you're just having a bad day and you're just screaming around. Nobody's fearing for their job. But if you do the same thing and you just have a mental breakdown as a C-level, a lot of people are starting to get really nervous. And I always found it super weird. Do you have some tactical things that you noticed on yourself in how you changed the way that you approach discussions where you have this particular power dynamic? Because I think we also do have this as advisors sometimes, where they're just oh, she has the answers. And I'm like, no, I don't. I'm just helping you trying to figure it out. Do you have anything like this as well?
Tactically, I use, and our team uses a lot, the word, this is my hypothesis. And it generally reminds people that we are using the data in front of us to make a guess at something with good reason, but it is still a hypothesis. And so that language has helped. Also, I think being kind of a very empirical minded, like the question is, does it work? Like we are always we're skeptics when we go into something. And so having that culture at our company makes it so that I can't, assert an opinion without real evidence on it. So the culture of kind of being a skeptic has helped, I think, ensure that people don't take my opinion too seriously.
I mean, I'm with you, but I'm still like in parts, I just know how difficult it is. So I did an interesting survey, actually. This is a bit of a tangent right now. So I've been writing a leadership guide about how to grow as a leader, right? So like, and as a leader, like as a senior leader in a company. And I was asking a question to my community in how open can you challenge the opinions of those above you, right? So like your leaders, your managers, that kind of stuff. And only less than 30% said, so the answers were about 100 plus or something. So less than 30 people said that they are having an open way and kind of challenging opinions of others. And the rest was scared, somewhat scared, or extremely scared and holding back. And then I was also posing a follow-up question. So for those that were saying like that they were somewhat scared or like holding back or whatever, like why? And the answer was fear of repercussions was, I think, the most dominant answer, closely followed with, I don't feel that my voice will be heard. And that kind of surprised me. And it now prompted me to actually maybe rerun this on a bigger sample set and also more diverse, because if it's my community, it's also it's a very selective kind of thing, because, my followers are very, very smart, of course. But I think it's very interesting in like how much emotions are still playing, like such a critical factor also internally and in companies and so forth, because I don't think that many managers are really that bad, but I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong in the sense of like with the conclusions, like that people are just not speaking up because of repercussions. I don't know.
I would imagine that if you do rerun this, would probably pull the data out between what they are nervous about speaking out on, because you could imagine that personnel issues are actually very scary, because anything you say against a coworker could look negatively on you because we're talking about our peers, and maybe pull that out from feedback on the product or feedback on the strategy. My hunch is that people are more scared to talk about personnel than they are about the thing that they're actually an expert in or their KPI is in, which may be around a product strategy or product growth motion.
It very often comes back to this kind of fear of like the employment. I don't know what it is, but so like one of my headlines in this article was like, as titles increase, feedback declines and ego grows. It's because, like we hear less. Yeah. And I started to notice this a couple of times where we also start to drink the Kool-Aid because we do not get negative feedback. And we're like, hey, everything that I'm doing is really, really good, until you really spectacularly crash and then things are going wrong. But anyways, it should not be the topic of today, but yeah, so wanted to share this with you. So you are in an incredibly fascinating field, and behavioral science is something that everybody's an expert in, obviously, right? Like we all know why everybody's doing everything. And yet at the same time, we cannot really figure out and kind of knowing like, how do we grow our product in an ideal way? And I know that you have been talking about this a lot. Can you maybe give us an introduction in how you touch these two things together? So like on one hand, the behavioral science aspect, and then this connection to tech where we talk about having mostly anonymous users in our funnels that then hopefully are buying something.
Definitely. And so let me just scene set for folks who don't know what behavioral science is. It basically kind of, the base is the economics world assumes that we're perfectly rational human beings. We make decisions based on time and money, and we move on. And we're, little Spocks kind of making these formulate decisions. And behavioral science says that's not actually the case, that we have lots of these underlying psychologies to push us to make a decision or not. It could be loss aversion, social proof, information aversion. And these types of things impact us on a day-to-day basis. And so if we study them, we can then learn more about what we currently do and maybe what we will do in the future. And so from a product perspective, this should be really, really interesting, because it says, one, we can understand our consumers more if we understand their psychologies. And two, it actually calls into question a fair bit of the existing research methods, which assume that asking people these types of interview questions could predict their future behavior. And I would say that's like one of the more contrarian things behavioral science offers, is that, interviews are great to get people's attitudes, preferences, and beliefs, and which is nice. You can understand their language, you can understand how they talk, but it's not as effective at predicting our future behavior, which means that when you're building a product, if you're relying on those interviews to predict somebody's future behavior, this is kind of a noisy signal. That's insight one. Insight two is that, well, what does impact our human behavior would be the environment of our decision making. And so I'll give you kind of the classic example that I have for myself is I really like M&Ms. And so if M&Ms were right next to me, I would be eating them during this podcast, like making, like disgusting noises as I chew, not caring about it because I like M&Ms. But if the M&Ms are farther from me, I wouldn't eat them because they're farther from me and I would have to get up. And the insight here again goes back to this, my attitude, preference, and belief towards the M&Ms has not changed at all. Just the environment of my decision-making has changed. And that again is an uplifting idea for product people, that the environment, the thing that you create with your UX, UI, your product actually can change my behavior. So, in a different world, we'd have to figure out how to change your mind and change your preferences and beliefs. In this world, in our behavioral science world, we have to design a product that helps you do the thing you want to accomplish. And that's kind of where the behavioral science applies. And that's what we do, is we design products that help people do the thing that they want to do, either at the top of the funnel or when they're in your product.
I have so many questions, and unfortunately, I will forget about 70% of them. Do you know, you probably do, but do you know this experiment with the superstitious pigeon from Skinner, where he was just at random intervals dropping food into, I think it was a box or something, and then the pigeon, whatever she was doing at that time, she was starting to pick up, or she thought that these two are kind of connected as well. And this is how I sometimes feel like we are in growth, where we kind of, we do A/B experimentation, which is flawed in itself as well, by the way. It's not a foolproof method as well. But I think we very often are also applying wrong connections between what actually happened and what caused it. So this causation versus correlation question and so forth. And so I would like to talk about all of it, of course. But just let me ask you one question, because you said something really interesting. Do you have an opinion on the Net Promoter Score? So Net Promoter Score asks the question on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely would you recommend this to someone else? Because I have a clear opinion. You probably have the same one. I don't know. But I learned in my UX research days that you should never, never, ever, ever ask someone about what they will do, rather than you will explore the past behavior and then you try to make from this predictions on future behavior. Would you subscribe to this, or would you say you love the NPS?
Look, I think in general, the idea of figuring out what we will do in the future is very difficult. And so for us, what we would use NPS for, if we were to use it, which we don't, but if we were, we basically say we have two different conditions. Now we will do an NPS for each condition. This would be one version of the product versus another version of the product, or one version of the feature versus another version. Now we get to compare NPSs, and we say, what is the difference between the NPS? So for us, we care less about the absolute value of a survey question, because who knows, my 9 is your 7, and we don't really understand how those differences affect. But when we have conditions where we could compare them and say, well, it's 20% higher NPS in this condition, we build our intuition to say, well, that condition, that version of the feature will likely perform better. So we use relative measures of understanding versus absolute. And then for sure, per your point, the mecca is figuring out what people do and using that to predict their behavior. The best predictor of if I will exercise today is if I exercised yesterday. Yeah. And so sadly, I did not exercise yesterday. And so I probably won't exercise today.
Oh, I did.
Yeah, there you go. So now you have a higher score. So we would more look at past behavior to predict our future.
So I think on this point of comparability, I'm with you. I'm 100% with you. But I still think also the structure of the question is really problematic, because it asks you about a future behavior. Some people could also misunderstand it. If I compare with how high the hit rate was of the metrics that I used, and then the conclusions that were drawn based on them, and then what actually happened in an A/B test where we actually could test the outcomes, I usually end up with the CSAT or the CES, the customer effort score, where we just ask people how easy was this for you at the end of a task. So we do not want to interrupt. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of best practices also, when you ask these questions and how you ask them. Can you maybe touch a little bit onto also what are very common mistakes that companies and growth teams maybe do when they try to explore the behavior, regardless now whether it's an NPS, a CS, a CSAT score, or whatever? What are very common mistakes did you feel like we could actually avoid?
Yeah, there's so many. So I'm going to try to, maybe I'll rapid fire them. Just to touch on the question aspect of it, I think a way to dramatically improve any kind of survey question is by asking people for a time frame. So in the last day, how many times did you brush your teeth? In the last day, or week, how many times did you? Instead of generally. And you could say, how likely are you to recommend this to a friend tomorrow? And now all of a sudden people are thinking about, well, would I recommend it to a friend tomorrow? And so adding that kind of time element gets us to be concrete versus abstract. And typically when people are thinking about something, we have such a hard time envisioning our future self that anything you can do to make it more concrete will actually get them to envision kind of how hard it would be to actually do the thing. So that's one. My sense is, and this is not revolutionary, and the thing our team works on because of it is really the first day that somebody's in the product. I think we call it like the day one. We assume that people will have more motivation on day 2 and day 3. The biggest motivation your user has is going to be on day 1 to do something. And the likelihood that they will remember to come back, want to come back, and then also set up that feature that you haven't pitched to them because you're waiting for the exact right time is much lower. And you can kind of imagine this for yourself. If you're signing up for a new product, you're giving it attention. 3 days later, when they send you an email reminder saying, we have something new for you, you just have less attention for them. And so attention tends to be kind of the thing that you're going for. You need someone's attention to do anything in your product. No. And so day 1, I think, is where we know it, like as a product community, we know that the first 7 days matters. I don't think people internalize it as much as they need to really have a successful product.
So here's a question to you, because this is one of the toughest challenges that I'm facing on a conceptual level with growth teams. So when we talk about growth, just like as a really quick definition for the people who are listening, I'm talking about the optimization to value in some kind of way. Like, how can I make it easy for people to understand the value? I'm not necessarily changing the product itself, like a sign-up flow, that kind of stuff. So on the conceptual side, we say that, well, in order to increase conversion, usually what you do is, even in B2B, you try to reduce the friction to the value. So we're trying to increase focus. We're trying to make it easy to understand. We're trying to match the promise of the value with the value experience. The higher this is, the more likely do we have a propensity to pay and so forth. Now, an interesting thing is, and I cannot remember in which study or in which fever dream it came to me, there is an interesting thing about on the first day. Unfortunately, it's not also just about like it's the first impression and so forth, but with subsequent usage of the product, we tend to discover less and less and less features as well, which means you're kind of the most open you are about new value is actually at the very start. So now I have these two conflicting ideas where I'm just like, okay, I need to kind of reduce the friction, which is true, but then there's also an optimal point in introducing additional value. So the things that are retaining you on top of something, right? So like the add-on value that is not relevant to everyone, but like that is going to come a little bit later. And I'm calling this like later stage growth, where you cannot really nail like a day signal or something like, oh, like after 30 days, we're going to send Kristen an email and then she's definitely going to buy. And it's not going to work, right? Like it needs to be always in some kind of usage trigger. The trigger needs to be more complicated. I don't know whether you have thoughts on this, but this is one of the most difficult challenges that I find to balance, because on one hand, you have the beginning of the funnel, which is, like getting someone in and so forth. But then on the retaining side, this additional upsell behavior is an art in itself.
Yep. So we did an experiment with One Medical. One Medical was bought by Amazon a little bit ago, but they are basically a UX UI layer to healthcare. So difficult to actually navigate the healthcare system that we just we need basically something that makes it easy. One Medical did that, has done that. And so they basically said, how do we get more people to book doctor's appointments? That's their whole shtick, is they make it easy for you to find a primary care and book a doctor's appointment. But it turns out when you're signing up new people from a base that isn't an employer base, let's say Google hires One Medical and says, we're giving this benefit to all of our employees. And now you randomly get an email as a Googler that says, you have this cool benefit from One Medical. Like before that email, no one was thinking about One Medical. And so you really, if people are clicking that button, you need to capture them in that moment to do something because they don't actually care about you, right? They're doing other things. They don't care about you. And so what they found is that kind of first use was failing for them. They dropped people into a landing page that said get care. You click get care, and now you have a list. It's an awesome list of how many providers you could choose from and the amount of times. Like I could get somebody immediately, like that day. That's wild. But there was a really long list, different locations. You had to click get care. So what our team did is basically move that experience into the onboarding flow. And we asked people a couple questions about their health. So we made it longer, which is, goes against this like anti-friction thing. We made it longer. The questions were very, very easy. It was there were no open text fields. And then we recommended them a provider to meet with, only one provider. We didn't have them choose which gender do you want, which location. We said, and here's a virtual appointment for you with 4 time options. And we increased bookings by 20% by putting it into the onboarding flow. And so I think the key thing there is that we added friction, but we set a mental model for what the app does that made it worth their time to be there. Because otherwise they'd be landed on the homepage. They'd have to figure out what the word get care means. Like who says get care? And they don't even know what One Medical does.
Please be sick. Yeah.
Yeah. And so and at some level, if we made it harder, we would have increased drop-off. So we once removed an open text field from an onboarding flow and increased page-over-page conversion by 40%. So those are the two conflicts. But if you have an open text field, even if it's ridiculously easy, having somebody type something is just going to be more friction for them than having them answer a multiple choice question.
So I want to defend both of us because I think we did not talk about the same friction. When I talk about friction, I talk about stuff that makes it harder for you to get to value. So when we talk about putting up signs to make sure that you're driving across the correct road, yes, you have to read more of them maybe, but it's going to help you still to arrive at the same road. The way that we think about friction as well this is interesting also like in human interaction design, the way that I learned it back then in like 1998 when Leah started to work in the professional field of tech, which is a long time ago, is to reduce the amount of clicks, right? Like this was the thing with Nielsen as well. Like, like you need to arrive at your destination, like 3 clicks or something like this. And with time, we also started to notice that this is not necessarily true. It also has to deal with the expectations of what someone actually expects something to be, like how complicated something is and their willingness to actually go through it and so forth. And it's actually not true that you just have to limit everything to 3 points, because what companies started to do is they just started to just cram more information in like one question or forms that were just overly complicated. And but I find that very interesting. But so the examples that you just gave, which I think are really good, we still have a problem. And I would like to understand from you as well, doesn't it matter like crazy how you describe the people that you are expecting to go through these? So you said, I think you described fundamentally 2 different groups, right? So like those that are the employees. And then the second group was people from Google that just, they just came from somewhere else. But in an ICP definition, so like an ideal customer profile, or in the traditional descriptions, you would have firmographics. Maybe you would also include some, the gender, or like above 35, North America, and so forth. None of this helps you in kind of determining how you should structure this, right? So what is your suggestion in how we should approach these profiles? So what do we have to know about our core user that we want to attack before we can make even decisions in this regard that you just said?
Yeah. So for us, before we get to any kind of ideal user, or not even ideal user, but we're like ruthlessly studying the environment that they're going through. And sometimes that does mean you need to pick a segment. So, for this One Medical experiment, the segment we picked was not people who made a considered purchase for One Medical or Flow. We picked the segment but the segment being defined by the context by which they're getting the email. They're getting it from their employer in a zero, awareness state. And now they're going to go through this sign up flow. And by the way, they think it's free. So they're not even valuing it because it's a free benefit from their employer. And so we understand basically the context somebody is going through. And again, by context, these are kind of synonyms for the environment, the steps. We call it a behavioral diagnosis. And so we'll do this 200-page deck of every single screen that somebody needs to do in order to get to the behavior that we want to change. and we're analyzing each and every step of that journey. In that world, then we're understanding, I think in kind of a classic, we're understanding the psychologies that are underlying it, which sometimes people could say is mindsets, but we're not doing any kind of classic segmentation or demographics work. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons is because it's about the thing that people are actually doing in that moment. So we think you can get about 80% of the way there by studying that and studying the actual steps someone needs to take. If we were to go into mindsets, we go into like confident or not confident, which signals new user or not new user. Do they know like I'm not into like shoes or clothes. And so if you were to recommend me some clothes, you can use social proof on me because I'm paying it. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm highly uncertain. I lack confidence. If you were to say, hey, Kristen, I have a behavioral science book for you. Most people like this behavioral science book. I'd be like, social proof doesn't work on me. I know behavioral science. And so by understanding people's mindsets in that context, you can then understand how you drive their decision-making.
I think that's a very important point as well. Like I always looked at it from the context of greenfield customers who, like, by the way, almost everyone has already some kind of solution for what you're trying to sell them, even if it's one that is not maybe in software. But I think it matters a lot whether it is a greenfield solution or whether they're replacing another kind of product in the kind of same space, which changes the entire messaging and so forth. So has it not always been also your experience that in principle, the customer agrees and they understand that they should now change something and they should focus? But getting to this focus step is sometimes super difficult because what you're essentially saying with focus is not just like, oh, these are now important. It's also like, hey, these other ones are not that important. Do you experience this as well?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that we're experiencing the most when we look at a new product or, if any, we're evaluating kind of switching costs is just status quo is the thing. We do the thing that's easiest. And the thing, again, kind of going back to this, like, if I'm going to exercise, it's because I did it yesterday. We do the same. We're creatures of habit. And so your job as a product person is to get me out of my status quo. And there's a lot of ways you could do that. You could offer me an immediate, by the way, this is what my favorite recent thing I saw, like, clicked is like all these telecom folks are offering people free iPhones to get them to sign a 3-year unlimited data plan. Now, the 3-year unlimited data plan is multi-thousands of dollars, but a free phone, holy moly, that is going to get me over the hump of signing a long-term contract. And so you can get me out of my status quo by offering me these wild, crazy immediate benefits because why not? Like, cool. Or you could get me out of my status quo because it's easier than the thing I was doing yesterday. And that's actually a harder game to play sometimes because you have to prove that you're saving time for people. And saving time is like something in the future and it's abstract.
Incremental as well. Yeah.
And so unless you're going to default me into something, you're going to tag a browser in my OS. Now we're talking that now it's going to be easier for me to do that thing. And I don't really care. Like that's kind of what Bing has done for Microsoft work computers. You don't have to make a decision on what browser you're doing. You're just choosing Bing because it's built into your Microsoft account at work. So all these folks are using Bing as a search engine, not with a decision to do it. And so you can play the easy game when you're changing people's status quo, but you're also going to have to tag it with the immediate benefit of something that gets me out of my status quo, which almost every single step of any kind of process to onboard somebody is going to have to give me enough benefit to overwhelm the cost.
Yeah.
And the cost is going to be high for new products and setup for sure.
And I think we should always think about building the benefit up first, right? So like before you cash it in. And this is also why I love PLG so much. I love this really like because you're the first one that really also formulates it this way. Because I'm always thinking about, if you think about like you have a freemium or an interactive demo and then a trial and then a full version, all of these have a different kind of purpose. It's not just like a better version of the other one. It just also means that, no, we're building some credibility with the client before we ask something from them. Specifically, like engagement is also increasing and so forth. And then we cash it in, but then we give them a little bit more and then we cash in again and so forth. So it just goes up. So I really love this way of thinking as well. And I'm very glad I'm on the side of science.
My favorite new free trial, I don't even have a word for it. I'm calling it kind of the Price is Right, which is Shopify's free trial, which is they let you in for free, no credit card, wild. this is Shopify. Basically, Shopify, for folks who don't know, is like, helps you create an e-commerce store. So this is for SMBs. You're going into it, zero credit card. You have 3 days to decide. At that point, you have to pay, but you pay $1 and you get access to it for 3 months. And so they've kind of solved in an interesting way the conundrum of credit card required free trials, which is basically credit card required free trial is likely the way most people should go, because otherwise you're having unqualified leads come in and use your product and you don't know who they are. And it makes them create a decision before they actually understand what you do, or there's high uncertainty. No. And so when people have high uncertainty, they tend to, we say, don't do anything. You take the path of least resistance, uncertainty goes up, you tend to do nothing. And so by giving you this free 3 days, but then requiring credit card with $1, actually kind of has a nice angle to this. And given that they test a lot, I don't know the results of this test, but I would imagine this is not an untested feature.
I can tell you the results of this relatively soon-ish, because the company that I'm working for right now as a CPO is Got Photo, and we are the Shopify for photographers. So what we do is we are actually a marketplace for photographers. And this is a little bit awkward because I'm also thinking about doing something similar. It's not the exact same thing, but we're also always looking, of course, to Shopify and so forth. But it is one of the core hypotheses as well that we can actually shift much, much more out of this. So, and just to give some context to the people here, what we're talking about. So Shopify and Got Photo and some other competitors are businesses that are making money on the transactional volume that the customer makes. So the GMV, so like the gross merchandise value. And then we have a take rate, or PayPal takes like 3%, and then Shopify takes another 2% and so forth. And the really cool thing about this business model that I love so much, because this is the first time I actually worked for someone like this, is that you have such a clear connection between the value for the customer and the revenue that you can measure. It's beautiful. I oftentimes do not have this, right?
And I think the critique here, which I think that's correct, and that is the optimal, is this idea of pricing drives value. I don't think SMBs, I'm highly confident SMBs don't pay attention to transaction costs as they're signing up.
That's true.
They have zero idea about, Shopify has 3 SKUs. They're paying attention to the features. They don't understand transaction costs will be the biggest driver of their costs.
Well, I only can speak for our company, of course. I can also not spill company secrets, of course. But here's a very interesting one. So the way that you also have to look at this is by territory. So different countries are wildly different in their behavior when we talk about price sensitivity. And I'm not just talking about, is this worth $10 or $15? I'm not just talking about purchasing power. I'm talking about, am I aware of what the competition is paying for, and how long do I spend on making sure that what I'm getting is a good deal? So it's not just about purchasing power. I'm not going to say more about this, but I'm just saying it's super fascinating how this changes from bigger countries like the US to Germany to the UK and so forth, even though 2 of these 3 people that I just mentioned, or the countries, are actually English speaking. It is really, really fascinating. And some of these motions do not work the same that if you just port them over, even if it's the same language, same copy, same product, same everything. This has been a huge learning for me. I don't disagree with you.
I do think this idea of getting a good deal can be a little bit universal. It's just the question is, how do you convey what's a good deal? So the psychology of not wanting to be cheated or feel like it's unfair can be pretty universal. And then how we signal that, sometimes it's a discount, sometimes it's relativity, sometimes it's a decoy. There's different anchors that you could give people. That then signals what's a good deal or not. And if you're aware of reference pricing, so if you're aware of what the competitors are doing in highly competitive markets, that then you can't be Shopify, which, puts it in small gray text and hopes that people don't pay attention, at least in the beginning. You need other signals.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I'm just saying there are specific countries in the world where if you reduce the transactional fee by 0.5%, even the smaller segments are starting to convert crazy. And I don't know what it is. I mean, I kind of do. But let's say, I cannot speak about it anyway. So it is a fascinating thing. We will talk about this in the post-recording. But if we're just already there, so on the pricing side itself, and because you also talked about this with me in the pre-talk really briefly, we have this problem with perceived value, and then this idea of what really is it, and so forth. And then we try to figure out as a company, where should we put the price? And then everything gets so complicated that most companies that I talk to are very, very scared of changing their price in the first place. And because they're so scared, because everything is so, like complicated, and we don't want to manage all of this, they go to studies. Now, this is a topic where I think we will have some disagreements, and I would love to hear your approach to this. When does it make sense? And how do you do it if you go with a study versus just like, hey, let's just experiment like straight away? Like, where is the right balance here when we talk about finding the right pricing?
Yeah, I think I'm an RCT A/B tester in general. And so I would say if you do have the resources and risk appetite, and risk being there's a small percentage of consumers who will always get mad at you for something. So if you're able to do that, and then you should probably experiment, and higher prices, starting higher is better because you can always come down if you start lower. So it's like a general rule of thumb, try to set your team up to do experiments. This could be even within the free trial anchoring, or have some level of dry testing that allows you to do dry testing, being if you click on something and people think that they're going to get it, they think they're going to secure that price, and then they're not actually going to secure it. They'll go on some wait list and you'll tell them later. Obviously, do this within reason. People should have ethics, blah, blah, blah. But getting some signal of actual behavior is going to be better than no signal of actual behavior. Given that people don't have resources and no risk appetite, then you basically have to use some of these methods. And I would say then, again, kind of if people ask us for an absolute price, it's very interesting. It's these questions, these studies make it seem like people have an absolute price in their head, and your job as a researcher is to pull it out. And that's not how the world works. Our pricing, our assignment of value is created on the spot. We don't really know that we're going to go into a Blue Bottle Coffee, which is a fancy coffee shop in San Francisco, and pay $8 for a cup of coffee. It's because it's fancy. There's a long line. There's small amounts of toast that you could get as well. And now all of a sudden we're willing to pay $8. If you also said how much you'd be willing to pay for a cup of coffee and it was in a gas station, you would never pay the $8. And so I think the first place our team focuses is on that context that you're setting, because that will drive willingness to pay. You can't ask somebody how much they would pay without that context, because it's unreasonable. So the methods that you have at your disposal is there's a segment called direct, which is asking people, how much would you pay for this? And this, how much is the max you'd pay? How much is the minimum you would pay? There's a segment called indirect, which is basically asking people in a kind of a conjoint or choice, which is, if you have 2 or 3 of these bundles, which of these bundles do you choose? And you place them, and you're kind of representing the actual market there if it's not a full conjoint. And then you also, by the way, have qualitative work. Our team does and relies a lot on qualitative work to understand reference points that people have in the market. If they do have a reference point, who's the buyer? We don't ask people to predict their future behavior in these qualitative interviews that we do. We're asking people about their current and past behavior so that we can make some assumptions about the willingness for them to actually pay. For the direct versus indirect methods, I would say the number one recommendation we have is decrease cheap talk, add incentives. What that means is that if you're going to ask me how much did you pay for something in a survey, I could say $14 a month, but actually if I never have to pay it doesn't, I'm not thinking about it really. I'm not actually projecting it. So in the academic literature, what you do is you basically say, how much did you pay for something? And by the way, at the end of the study, we're going to have a lottery. If the lottery comes out that it is your cost or lower, then you actually have to pay for it. And it's a lottery, so you may not actually have to pay for it. If we can't make people pay in these kind of online experiments, which is basically saying you don't get a fee, you say you could get the chance to get that thing. And so if it comes out that your price is within range, you could actually get the chance to get it. If it doesn't come out, if you said you wouldn't pay, you would only pay $5 and it's actually $14, then you don't get a chance to get the option, to get the widget. And so what that hopefully does is get people to think. That's the only thing we want, is people to think. And to think about if they would really want this thing, then they would actually maybe put a number that's closer to real for this. The other, I think having this kind of incentive alignment, you reduce cheap talk, has been found to basically what's called reduce hypothetical bias, which is what we're kind of fighting against, which is this idea we're just making up a number. And then you're going to say something that's too large, and then companies are going to kind of or actually just too noisy. It's just too high of a range. People are going to say all sorts of numbers and you actually don't know what's true. Yeah, I'll send you an article on this if you want to put in the show notes.
I will definitely read it as well, because this is one of the topics that I'm always fascinated about. And I think we talked about this as well, like in regards to the Westendorp analysis, which has been quite widely used by every marketing agency that I know, and it just never came to be even close to what we actually needed. And you can also do this kind of research also wrong. But if I'm just repeating back to you what you just said, and I think it's a very good point that you actually made, is that value is created in the context of where something lives. And it's not just a product. And I always try to tell people as well, like, look, your product does not have an inherent value. It's always like with whom it actually is. And that person that is going to be hopefully the buyer also has a specific context in the time. So there's not just the right product for them, but also the right time for them. And the job for us as product people is to find the right time to actually open the pricing discussion, and then also sell the correct way for them to try it out and then also do it. And that is a very difficult kind of job. But you can do so many things just wrong through bad research that I usually default to, let's please just do a practical test with a smaller segment. Because if you have a bigger company, you can afford to run, like, oh, we don't want to have like 2 payment plans afterwards running that we have to manage and so forth. But the cost of a wrong pricing survey is just so infinitely higher, because you just... No.
Yeah, I think also just changing pricing is worth it. This is the top way that companies can grow, is by changing pricing and getting it right. So would definitely emphasize, if you haven't changed your pricing in a year, you should be changing your pricing.
I wrote an article, which I forget now the numbers because I'm dyslexic, so it could be wrong on this, but I think I helped with the study with Paddle. So Paddle was analyzing about, 10,000 of payment providers. Paddle is a payment provider that has access to 10,000 of companies that are using them as a payment provider. So they see also in the background, like, what these companies do, what they make, what they earn, and so forth. And an interesting data point was that if you do experiment with pricing, regardless of like what you do, whether you increase, decrease prices, or just like if you're just doing it, you tend to have a much higher ARPU than companies that do not do it. And I think this goes to the point that it could also be that companies that do experiment more often are more successful in general. And then, there's also some bias in there probably, but I do think it also plays to the point that you do not know often what you do not know. And sometimes you also find like these adjacent knowledge pieces in studies like this that absolutely have nothing to do with pricing. You just start to hear like from a specific segment that you did not expect to respond really surprising, for instance, right? Like this is also something that I had also with the pricing study, where you just like started to see a specific segment just say crazy numbers, and you're like, why would you pay this much? And they're like, well, because I make so much. If I'm going to have this on the other side, I'm happy to pay you for this. Please take it off me. And I think that's where product innovation sometimes also has to be. Like, you sometimes do not know the correct question in some kind of way, or you do not know what you don't know, right? I don't know.
Well, I think that insight too is reference point. So basically, if you have a reference point that you're paying $40 a month per user for some software, the idea that another software is going to ask you for $40 a month per user for some software doesn't seem wild. If you don't have that reference point, it will seem very high, or could seem very high to people, or very low if it's something where most of your stuff you're paying more than that as a flat fee. So we need to give people reference points that help them understand, one, if it's a good deal, that it's a good deal, and two, that it's worth it for them because of some other comparison that they've gotten value on, or something that is higher and not a good deal for them, or something that's lower and they obviously don't want. So giving people kind of a sense of what the landscape is. Otherwise, they're going to think back to, you don't know what the reference point is, and they're going to think back to last year when they were at their company negotiating with a vendor, and this is this is how they negotiated. So you have to kind of, as the team, set the anchor that they're going to look at as a good deal.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. And I have one more question in this regard. When we think about B2B customers in that sense, right? So like now we're also talking about like price sensitivity of companies in that sense. And I would like to understand, like, so how do you separate in your head how you conduct a study like this if we're going more up market, without now specifically saying like how big, but like, let's say we go from a really small company, which is almost behaving like a B2C customer in a lot of ways. They can make independent decisions. They can spend money if they want to. They don't have to think about it for a purchase for $10 and so forth. Versus bigger companies where we start to go up market, like mid-market and so forth. So like, how do we change this entire story now around, and like what changes also in the surveys in how we conduct them?
Yeah, we tend to do for larger clients like that. We would ideally like to start with an in-depth qualitative work to understand what I keep saying this, but understand what their reference points are.
Yeah.
Because if they don't have the reference points, you have to set them. If they do, you have to compete with them. And so that's just kind of step one. Step two, we just completed a 200-person willingness to pay study with top level HR managers. And it turns out they have very high understanding of the reference points on some of these benefit offerings. And so we ended up doing, and this is kind of, this is our behavioral science lens, but we did 3 conditions, framing the offering different for each condition. And then we used the direct method, we used the indirect method. So we're combining methods, but we're not using that as again, we're using the reference, like, is this better than the other thing you could have launched? Like, you could have launched something else. And so let's get a willingness to pay for that thing and the thing that you're looking at right now. So we're basically kind of triangulating a fair amount of the work by using these different methods, but also starting with the qualitative work.
So let's say you're coming in from an external and you say like, yeah, like, let's get this done for a client. Like, what is a typical time frame where you say like, yeah, okay, like, this is and we're talking about realistic, like, what is a realistic time frame from start, practical with all the problems, like reaching the correct people and so forth for the study? How long does it take for something like this to do in the way that you do it?
Yeah, so we would do probably qualitative work in around 6 weeks and quantitative work in around 6 weeks. So it's about a 3-month project to do qual and quant. And what that looks like is 2 weeks. If it's quant, you have to figure out who is your audience, and you have to actually spend a week or 2 making sure that you can get access to them. You have to then get all the questions written and approved, 1 to 2 weeks for it to be in the field and 1 to 2 weeks for it to be data collected. And that's if the company can approve the questions, because sometimes, internally people need all this buy-in. So 6 weeks is like, we need all the context so we can write the questions, and we need you guys to get on board. So I would say 3 months to do qual and quant in kind of an ideal fashion. Yeah, I think most companies, it's like a quarter. So it's like, okay, we're going to change our prices next quarter. Let's do research this quarter. Great. Wonderful. It's just a planning exercise, right? And by the way, if you're going to change your prices anyway, you're going to need to have some rollout plan. So simultaneously, you can be planning the rollout plan to figure out like how you're going to communicate with customers, what's going to be the messaging, what's actually going to be changing on the pricing lineup.
What a disappointment it would be if you came back after your study and said like, well, the prices they're perfect. Like nothing is going to change. It's exactly.
Well, I think my sense is sometimes prices. So again, there's 2 levers here. The prices actually may not be bad, but you could change the pricing value equation, which then gets more people interested in the thing you're offering. And again, that is actually much easier to experiment with changing the actual numbers, because you're just changing the framing, you're changing the value you're giving people. And there's lots of ways companies mess up in how they create that. Pricing is obviously the biggest drop-off page. And so how do you increase my motivation to get over that pricing decision? And there's lots of opportunities to just increase conversion at the point of paying.
Okay. So I think pricing pages would be another podcast in itself, by the way. So I would be very interested. So like my comment, like the thing that I see companies do mostly wrong is like they do not have a concise summary. Like they lose their focus with time. They just add too much crap, and they cannot guarantee that actually people really retain what they want to say. So, like the 2 or 3 core kind of arguments. One last question to you in this regard. Would you say, and because I'm very careful when I start to query or start to survey existing customers, when you do a pricing study, do you also have an opinion or like a guideline roughly whether you should do it more on existing customers, or is it more on potential customers that have never heard from you? As in, we are an independent someone, we're not telling you for whom we're doing the research. Do you also think that it actually matters quite a lot? Because I'm very hesitant in doing too much research on existing customers, because it kind of masquerades the picture in the market that matters usually more for acquisition. But maybe I'm missing something. Do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, we just did something on existing customers because they were talking about upgrading. So they wanted people to upgrade. So for sure, if you have a base of folks and you want them to move to a different SKU, move to from, freemium or what, for sure do it on your existing if that's the goal. If not, then yeah, we actually, your testing something that is going to go to people who don't have an anchor and people who do have an anchor about you and already know you, have experienced the product. So also in our willingness to pay studies, we try to be as lifelike as possible. So we'll do videos to show people what that means, what the product is. Like, this is not just a description, a 2-line description about the product, right? This can be animations, this can be a demo. That's all in kind of when we did this like 200-person HR study, we're doing very, very strong visuals, making people look through the visuals to see like, yes, I get it. I get what I'm going to be paying for. And so for the new user, you have to get them on board, but know that they have zero experience. And so their responses are just going to be way different than existing.
And I think, I don't know, I have too much to say. I have to shut up because we almost have been going for 1 hour. I have one little bonus question, the last one, because
Great.
I'm always interested in this. How much to the beginning of someone's payment process are you interested when you're studying anything in this regard? So what I'm talking about is that I was always a big fan of like also understanding and like, not just like looking how people are interacting with the website, but like how their workplace is looking like, what their context is in the day and so forth. I know this goes sometimes a little bit overboard, but I'm always fascinated with how far that people really would go in this regard. So like, what do you actually record in these calls and what are you trying to kind of figure out about people and what do you think, where does it stop to make sense? But like, where should people go a little bit of the extra mile?
Yeah, we just did qualitative interviews with 12 people, kind of Shopify-ish people, not exactly Shopify-ish people, but like small businesses with e-commerce exposure. And they would tell us about the tools that they were using. And we would say, can you project what the tool is and show us how you use it? So we basically want people to show, don't tell. Because basically when they are saying something, you as the interviewer have an idea of what they mean that could just totally not be right.
No.
And so when they're, or like, you know, we're asking them, how would you navigate to figure out a service for this particular thing? It's like, please type it into Google and show me.
No.
And then when they type it into Google, they're saying different things than what you would have guessed. They would say from this idea of like, oh, I would search for some free tool like this. And so it's a show, don't tell model. And when we do it, Intuit actually has a nice idea of these, they call them follow me homes. And they're actually literally going to your home. This is pre-COVID. And they would like look at you as how you do your accounting, because Intuit's an accounting company. And they would see the stacks of papers and they would see all these things. And then they would build an invoicing solution. So you didn't have to do those invoices. I think right now that could be overkill from like, you don't want to boil the ocean as well. But the idea is very critical, right? The idea of like looking at someone's details of their digital or their physical environment is very important. I also think like going, you know, too broad and being like, how do people understand savings? It's like, we know a lot about most things at this point. We don't need to kind of like pretend that we're starting from scratch.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I think it's a good takeaway to start from Google rather than from your homepage. I think let's just say that, right? Like we still also want to understand that kind of connection. Kristen, this was absolutely fantastic. I could go for another 3 hours, but unfortunately you don't have the time. And so how should people get in contact with you? Do you want them to get in contact with you? Do you want the irrational or the rational people? How should they get in contact with you?
Yes. Yeah, so we do a fair amount of consulting. We do it on product growth. We do it on 0 to 1 product development, and we do it on pricing. We have a team of behavioral scientists. And so if folks are interested in this, I would say just email me, Kristen@irrationallabs.com. And, you know, I do Substack teardowns, which people tend to enjoy, which is basically taking a product and 5-minute videos. And we have a newsletter and stuff with case studies that share of our experiments. So that would be another way to just stay in touch. But you can always just email me or LinkedIn and blah, 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 all the things that you can do now.
We'll be in the show notes and really excited about this. Also like Substack teardowns. Oh, this is great. You know, there's so much to talk about in our next episode. But that's it for today. This was The Producty. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you for spending the hour with me.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. This is enjoyable.
Oh, we're done. Thank you so much for listening to The Producty with Leah. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leahtarin.com, which is leahtarin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.